I'm Dr. Jean Sherman, founder and director of SCCI, the Sherman Centre for Culture and Ideas. SCCI takes you to London, where we sit down with British architects Tom Emerson and Stephanie MacDonald, co-founders of 6A Architects. I was introduced to the work of 6A Architects via Nikos Kalogeropoulos and Nectar Evkarpidis of the Molonglo Group, a visionary property development company based in Canberra. 6A Architects is best known for its contemporary art gallery designs, their educational building projects, their artist studio projects, and their residential projects, all of which are sensitive to historical contexts. In the Southern Hemisphere, 6A Architects is currently working with landscape architects Dan Pearson Studio and the Australian firms Fender, Katsoulidis and Openwork on the Molonglo Group's Melbourne-based project Walk Up Village. 6A Architects' portfolio came to public attention for RIBA-awarded Raven Row in 2011. Raven Row is a contemporary gallery space previously built in the 1690s and later remodelled by Huguenot silk weavers in the mid-18th century. SCCI is delighted to return to the UK ahead of the Foundation's London 2021 Hub, which will be hosted in partnership with London's Design Museum. SCCI is proud to bring this episode and others to you during a time of closed borders and travel restrictions. Emerson and Macdonald are now joined by our London correspondent and global emissary, Dolla Merrillees, author, curator, cultural consultant, and treasured SCCI collaborator. Thank you for joining us.
Tom and Stephanie, I wanted to start off by asking you about the origins of 6A, because in a way it suggests anonymity. Was this deliberate?
I think it was partly accidental, partly deliberate. Our address is 6A. You came in through the front door, and we used to kind of meet here, and we'd say, and it's quite an unusual sort of space, a bit sheddy, and we'd come and meet here, and we'd just say, meet you at 6A or whatever. So 6A became kind of parlance. And then it was more conscious that we didn't want to be surnames, and it was a little more collective in the way that it presented itself. And there's a lot of different people have contributed to it over the years as we've grown, and are kind of very much part of the practice. So.
And I mean, 6A is your home now, and you began your practice here. I think you said your son used to sleep behind the filing cabinet.
Yeah, we used to hide his cot behind the filing cabinets, and keep all his clothes and toys in the cabinets and hide them when the landlord came around. Now it's a little bit more legit, and we're allowed to live here. So.
In your book, Never Modern, which was published in 2013, Irene Scalbert writes that you are, by your own admission, reasonably promiscuous in your choice of sources and influences and Catholic in your tastes. It's a sentiment that really kind of appeals to me. In setting up 6A, was it really important for you to establish a distinct philosophy in order to define your practice? And like your choice of name, is it about deliberately not being prescriptive?
I think when Tom and I met at the RCA, there were two kind of really fundamental influences that we came across there, which one was George Perec, who was introduced to us by a poet called Miles Champion, who was a flatmate of someone, and at college there. And that was a kind of real revelation, George Perec, and Tom went on to write about him when he was at Cambridge. And Richard Wentworth was the other person. And these are things that we have grown more familiar with. We were maybe introduced to at the RCA, but then it was over the sort of following next few years that we really kind of discovered them and have become friends with Richard. And I think what was really interesting about both those two people was that it was a way of looking at things that was understanding what you had in front of you and kind of almost taking a kind of survey of a place or of what you're looking at, finding ways to see stuff that had become invisible through use and through kind of familiarity. And so that's kind of an approach that I think we've taken into our work, and it's maybe been expanded on, but it's an approach that allows you to have a fresh set of tools with every project. We don't we go in there to find what it is we're working with. So it is promiscuous in a sense, because if you're working with Milton Keynes Newtown, that's going to be a very different vocabulary from Raven Row, kind of Huguenot houses. And then we also pick up, which is something maybe both Richard and Perec. Richard is an extraordinary kind of raconteur or a pathologist of the city almost, but he picks up human intentions and kind of tenderness as much as kind of physical material artefacts. So I think we can bring a lot of different things into that. If one talks about Catholic taste, it's not limited to just the set of tools that the kind of material. You've got material clues, but then you also bring things in that might be anecdotal, or social, or programmatic, and that gives you quite a rich.
I mean, when I look through your projects, there's this real sense in terms of what you're talking about layering. And when we were talking about 6A and you were taking us through the house, it's got such a layered history itself, and you've sort of uncovered that over the past 20 years. Can you talk a little bit about that process and also about some of the things you've found in that process of discovery?
Yes, I suppose that because our work started very much with projects in London, so now they're kind of all over. But in London, there are very few corners that haven't been contested, that haven't seen all sorts of different events, different lives, sort of successes and traumas all overlaid. So we found that the moment you started working with a place, the moment you started looking at it in a certain way, kind of quite objectively, once you started consulting archives, you could find almost the story of the city passing through the tiniest little corner. And that seemed to produce a lot of material clues. So we're very interested in kind of materiality, how things are made, how they decay, how they're remade, how they're repaired. And somehow this kind of idea of excavation, or this idea of sort of, some people call it detective work, of trying to not to judge important things versus unimportant things, that everything is a clue. And you don't know until the end of the project which one is the one that's going to generate the ideas. It could be something completely incidental and anecdotal, or it might be something that is absolutely fundamental to the architecture of the place. So I guess that is something that kind of London produces, and then you find that actually other places also produce it, but in different ways. And the one that we're most familiar with is this city, because it's where we live and where we work. But also it's really interesting to then bring that kind of method to bear on somewhere in New York or in Hamburg or in Melbourne, as where we're working now.
Here as a project, as a place, we've kind of started in one little building and then moved to the bigger building and then joined them up, moved the studio around over 20 years. And when we joined the two buildings together, we did a trial pit. And it went down and down and down and down in the courtyard. I mean, like, what's this? This isn't a foundation, this is a wall. As we went down to the basement and had a look and saw two blocked up doorways, lintels we'd never noticed, which were under arches behind the shops in front of us. And we knocked through them and we found them full of 1936 rubble, like there were newspapers from 1936. And that's what they used to do just before the Second World War. It was cheaper to leave the rubble in there. We cleared them out and they had all the old brick fins for kind of storage. And then one of them actually had another 2 metre down well full of groundwater in there. So it's kind of amazing. And Tom made a slide actually. We include this building as part of in some talks and things. And there's a slide you've got which has like an oyster shell that we found when we were digging, where we dropped the level in the courtyard. I think there was a bit of blue Delft pottery. And then there was a photograph from here of Claude
Williams.
Claude Williams, one of Massive Attack, who used to be in this building. Their management were in this building when we first moved into the little one next door. Then that's a kind of funny little kind of palimpsest of the history, layers of history. I think the oyster shells were the fast food of kind of Georgian London.
I mean, in a way, you're kind of coalescing the contemporary and historical narratives of the site. I mean, Raven Row in Spitalfields in particular, I think is a really interesting example of this. It's now a contemporary arts centre. I'm really interested in about your approach to research, because I know that you do a lot of research about your sites, but also in reference to Raven Row, you've got an extraordinary story to tell about what you discovered.
The research really depends on the place. So some places have more, there's more material, and some you have to find for yourself. But Raven Row was listed Grade 1, and so we went to one of our favourite archives in London, the London Metropolitan Archive, which collects all the sort of eccentricities of kind of London's past. And in there we found a shoebox which had about 70 photographs of the building from 1903 to the 70s of unknown photographers who went back over and over again, and they track you could say the fall and rise of Spitalfield, or the rise and fall. So initially it's a very kind of plush, upper middle class environment, very beautiful 18th century interiors, and then it falls into ruin when Spitalfields becomes essentially a slum and actually was due for demolition. And people went back and they took these photographs, and we still don't know really why or who. And in that box there was also the receipt for one Georgian panelled room from the Art Institute of Chicago, which is kind of one of the most extraordinary documents. But what does that even mean? And it turns out that one of the rooms on the first floor, a very intricately carved Rococo panelled room, was removed in the 1920s and taken as a room set to the Art Institute of Chicago, and it was known as the Georgian Room, and there are photographs of it as a sort of museum set piece.
You can just tell from the light coming over the architrave.
Yeah, there's a little kind of rope to stop people kind of coming in, and it's in their kind of catalogue as the Georgian Room. And then through various events that we're not entirely clear about, it found its way back to a shed, or to a barn in Essex that was owned by a trustee of the Spitalfields Trust, and was sort of sitting there for several decades. Anyway, with a colleague, we tracked it down and then managed to get it back restored and then back into the building. But in the time in which it was away, the buildings had burnt down or had several fires in them. So it turns out that now it's the only original 18th century, complete original 18th century room in the building, because it wasn't there when the fire hit. So it's this very curious sort of world tour that somehow leads to a piece of rather wrong-ended conservation. It was absolutely fabulous sort of thing to follow, because it happened as the rest of the project and the new parts were being made, as other pieces were being restored. So it was probably London at its kind of most kind of deliriously sort of productive in terms of stories and events and eccentricity.
I mean, the other term that you use, or that I've seen you use, is around situations, and it's referenced in your book Never Modern in relation to Raven Row. But Thomas, you also used it in reference to Jürgen Teller's photographic studio, in which you spoke about changing situations. So in that context, is it about immersion? Is it about what surrounds you?
I think with Jürgen Teller's studio, the thing that became apparent working on the studio with him is that he is not interested in a neutral environment, a neutral studio space. That's where the term situation, he's interested in people in real situations. So how people find themselves to be, whether it's in this room or any other room or in a railway station, or and that is where you can somehow capture the fullest version of themselves, of them. And so that became really interesting, that it wasn't about making quote-unquote studio spaces, it was about making fantastic places in which things could happen. And then those things especially with somebody with a photographer like Jürgen, those things could be anything, and that's something that is way outside of our control. But as long as you make places that somehow provoke something, that's kind of what we try to do, and what keeps on being productive.
You were talking earlier about a city like London where you're constantly crashing into the past. Herbert Butterfield, an historian of the 1920s, wrote, "The memory of the world is not a bright shining crystal, but a heap of broken fragments. All history is full of locked doors and of faint glimpses of things that cannot be reached." And Tom, I think when we were speaking, you were saying that there's no such thing as a greenfield site. Everything has a history, whether it's environmental or building-wise. In that sense, do you see yourselves as architects, as storytellers? And I suppose I'm thinking about Coastal House in Devon, which springs to mind, as does Cohen Court in Cambridge and the South London Gallery.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I think it is about kind of uncovering the narratives of a site, that there are those clues everywhere. The Coastal House was an interesting one because it was, that was a very kind of banal house when we got there. You didn't really know what was going on with it. And it was only when we started to peel back bits, we suddenly found it had these half-metre thick stone walls, really rubbly, cheap stone, kind of very dusty. But by stripping that back almost to a ruin and then kind of rebuilding into it, with that one it was super interesting because we could suddenly do something that was only now with technology we could insulate it and clad it, and we could do it without kind of membranes. So it was totally breathable, but keeps an amazing climate in there. So we could sort of bring that stone into a contemporary use, kind of super insulated and really kind of efficient energy use. So in sustainability, that was great. And our job there was really just connecting it back to the landscape. It had been sort of plinithed, we de-plinithed it. And what we did was we kept all the original openings and just dropped them straight down to the ground. So you had these super high, tall doors out with big fan lights and then doors out on all sides, the landscape. And weirdly, it only had 2 doors to get out to this incredible landscape overlooking the sea, sort of 180 degrees view. So that had kind of, and the landscape had been worked, it had been part of 2 farms, that had all been done first, kind of over 6 years, so it was quite established, and then we just came into that and worked, reconfigured everything. And from the outside, it almost felt like it hadn't changed. It was almost like it had been reclad, but it had been fundamentally, radically altered internally and just connected back. Cowan Court is quite a different thing. I guess, yeah, Dartmouth was dealing with its own place in a sense, and then Cowan Court had the whole of Cambridge around it and a history of courtyards and as a typology. We were amazed that nobody else proposed a courtyard. That college has 10 courtyards already. So we did a courtyard, we did a doppelganger, and then just really looked closely at what the original building was, and it was a kind of minerality to it, of kind of brick and board-marked concrete. And so the new courtyard was the same size, and instead of having a specimen tree in the middle, it had a forest in the middle, a birch forest, and the rooms looked out instead of in. So you kind of had the horizon as you went into your room, and then you had the forest as you came out of your room. So it was a kind of funny inversion. And it used all timber construction and reclaimed boards externally. And they were kind of layered, tiered in the way the original courtyards were. So where they were kind of mineral tiers, we used the tiering to actually weatherproof the ends of the timber cladding. So that was quite an old detail in a sense.
And so in our building, we decided that every floor would project very slightly in front of the next, partly as a reference to timber frame tradition, but partly as a reference to the original Brutalist college that has this kind of concrete banding. So essentially the project is kind of in conversation with the original college, and we wanted it to feel like it belongs to the brutalism of Churchill, which is really fantastic, but at the same time be the 21st century version of what had been sort of quite a heroic bit of 20th century, mid-20th century architecture. Yeah. So are they similar or are they different? To some extent it doesn't really matter. To some people they're very similar, to some people they seem completely at odds.
But strangely, kind of using that old timber, the timber came from old railway carriage floors, and that that was kind of already very aged and kind of dark and greyed, and then it became sort of almost like it felt like the colour of the boardmark concrete. You know, as they became closer in materiality, even though one was completely timber and one was completely concrete, it was almost like there was a sort of dialogue between them. And the energy, the sustainability was kind of, I think the energy use is like a fifth of the original buildings.
And I think the biggest lesson that we've learnt is about freedom of choice, about leaving options open. We don't think that we've got any crystal ball that tells us what people's social and economic aspirations are going to be during the next 20 years or so. I think this is perhaps best illustrated by the type of plan that we've got. The plan here shows a gridiron of roads. And this gridiron of roads, together with the parkland and the city centre, is really the skeleton of the city. And this is the skeleton that is going to be absolutely magnificent. I think the important thing really is that Milton Keynes, although we're concerned about the beautiful buildings and the design that goes into it, essentially it's about people and not about planners or architects or economists or accountants.
I mean, another project of yours which references the past is MK Gallery at Milton Keynes. And thank you, because we went and saw it over the weekend and the weather was kind of atrocious, but it was wonderful to see it. I mean, Milton Keynes is such an interesting place. It was a textbook utopian project of the 1960s, the vanguard of modernist civic design and part of the Garden City ideals. How challenging or even intimidating was it to come into that sort of past history and that original idealism, and what was the result?
It was, I mean, again, it's one of these contexts that's really, really fabulous, and it's probably one of the very few places in England, given our conversation now about the past, it's one of the very few cities in England that is entirely directed towards the future, and always has been. And so somehow it had a completely different kind of vector in how everybody relates to the city and what meaning it gives it. So that was really exciting, to be in a place that everybody was looking forward to what was going to happen next, which, let's say in London, everybody's kind of worried about, it's not going to be as good as before. So that was already fantastic. Then the other thing that was really interesting as a context, it was the fact that it's unfinished business, that there was this utopian idea, part of it was built, and a great deal of it wasn't, for various reasons, political and so on. And so it became very exciting to try and use the context, that which is not there, as your context, that which is unfinished. And so then the project becomes this sort of idea of assimilating a few of the many utopian ideas that somehow felt like they needed closure or needed some sort of completion. So the project itself is in a sense the summation of the kind of the infinite grid of the city and the kind of orbital landscape of Campbell Park, this kind of wild sort of sculpture, sort of almost land art piece. And so we have a circle and a grid. So it's very, very simple sort of, I suppose, resolution of those things. And then there are lots more elements within it. There are artworks within the building, and of course then there are the exhibitions and playscapes and landscapes and so on. But essentially it was, the context was that which never happened, which became a kind of really exciting, sort of quite abstract idea of context.
And we worked with two artists all the way through with that, Gareth Jones and Niels Norman, and what was amazing was Gareth had been a child and grown up there in Milton Keynes as it was built, and his mother worked for the Development Corporation, the Milton Keynes Development Corporation. So he just had like first-hand experience of going into the crazy yellow-painted Development Corporation offices, which were so they were so almost evangelical about this new town and what it could do. And
in fact, you reference those colours
yes,
throughout the building. And
well, that was Gareth. So he had in his studio a collection of all the Habitat catalogues from that time. So he picked out the 1976 Habitat catalogue and the colour palette that it would be, didn't he? And he had the Metropolitan and the Pastoral set of colours, which are kind of employed depending whether you're...
So the artists made a whole environmental project called City Club, which is one of the great unbuilt sort of promises of Milton Keynes, and somehow it tries...
Which had sooks and rodeos and things.
Yeah,
in it,
it's kind of wild.
It's brilliant.
I mean, it was bonkers. I mean, it was even more bonkers than Super Studio or Archigram, and they were serious. They really meant it. But anyway, it didn't happen. And so Gareth and Neil somehow brought some of that design history into the building, into the environment around it. Somehow, it's almost like not allowing these stories to disappear. And so when you meet some of the rather eccentric colours in the loos everywhere, you have to kind of ask, you sort of like, who would pick colours like this? And then that somehow prompts the story to unfold.
Yeah.
One of the other projects that you're working on is that you're designing towers for the Molonglo Group in Melbourne's Collingwood. And I think you've just got planning permission that you mentioned. It's been described as a walk-up village, which will investigate methods for encouraging chance encounters in the vertical. And as I understand, it's going to be mixed use with planted spaces and a rooftop garden. Is the idea that it's as much about sustainability as it is about a sort of a new form of urbanism?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, it's really interesting. We've been working with a landscaper, Dan Pearson, since the beginning. And there is a lot that you can bring into a building to start with, just in terms of that idea of what you find on the ground. I mean, I think one of the briefs from Molonglo was just to kind of, what is it in the street, what is it in the city that one likes, and what disappears when you begin to go up, and that becomes siloed into offices or residential and doesn't add to kind of city life anymore. And it was interesting, they ran sort of workshops with people in Melbourne, sort of from all different walks and things, and it was really interesting hearing people's favourite moments in the city, sounds, kind of places they go to, what they miss, and what they like, and identifying those things. And I think then when we approached it, as I said, we work with a landscaper, and you can do things with a big building and infrastructure like that you can build in soil reserves, and you can make sure that you're using all your water for irrigation, which could be for the street as much as for your building, and then natural ventilation, and the kind of, it is very sustainable. But it's as much to do with sustainable community, I think, and their curated tenancies, which I think is a really important part of it. And then you have these spaces that do begin to bring some of those moments of street life back, and those kind of moments of not being in one place or another, but where you can bump into someone, where stuff's happening. And I think that's what we've tried to do with the walk-up section of the building, is bring that in.
The client, who had very strong ties to Greece, were always referencing Mediterranean hilltop towns. You might, on foot, cover very, very large vertical distances that you would never consider doing within a building. But in a kind of Italian or Greek town, you just do it because you're going to the fishmonger or to the cafe. And so this idea of the walk-up village was like, what is it that those places have that mean that you're prepared to walk and be so kind of physically engaged with a place that we're not prepared to do in cities, in tall buildings. So the idea was, can we reproduce some of the stimuli, some of the kind of irregular encounters within this project that would then stimulate people to move around it, and then maybe to have a more, maybe not even urban, because actually at one point it was called the walk-up city, and then it became the walk-up village, which is actually much better description of the thing, particularly since the idea of kind of locality has really grabbed the attention of the kind of the COVID and post-COVID way of experiencing work life, home life, and so on. So there's a lot of writing going on, sort of rediscovering the village, because somehow COVID has sort of made a kind of imploded us somewhat, and suddenly realised actually these small distances, these proximities are really interesting, and maybe even more interesting and productive than the long distances that we became accustomed to through cheap travel and all that.
And we shouldn't forget, actually, we started with Collingwood. I mean, what an amazing area anyway, and quite unique in itself as that kind of working area, and the way that those buildings just open up straight onto the lanes, and the kind of, the way people are using them anyway, kind of inside and outside, and bringing kind of planting and a kind of ad hoc informality to use, and it's quite ambiguous. You can kind of walk straight through some of them. And I think that's something maybe that's also happened with Jürgen's, where there's 3 buildings interspersed with 3 gardens of kind of equal dimension, and he shoots in all of those spaces, inside or outside, and you step outside to go inside there. And it's happening with quite a few of the houses that we're doing at the moment as well. And I think yes, I think with COVID even more so. I think our streets should be gardens. And I think it's maybe part of a bigger picture of it, considering, and it's something we've talked about a lot, but considering kind of ourselves as less separate to nature, and perhaps a single ecology, that we have to be more mindful of what we're doing, that we are the same ecology. And therefore, if we're not mindful of how we're treating that in all aspects of it, it's all the climate sort of conversation, we're going to lose that. So I think in designing, we're designing as much with the ground, with the gardens, the ground, the kind of ecology of a site.
The other thing I heard Jonathan talk about was he talked about the linearity of fashion exhibitions in museums, that they're very uptight and very precious in the way that the garments are conserved, displayed, put behind glass, very static, and that it lacks reality, and ultimately garments are made to be worn. I mean, having worked on a lot of fashion exhibitions, I find the flexibility and the inflexibility in restrictions very frustrating.
Yeah. They brought school kids in and let them dress up in the clothes, in all the clothes, amazing. And then also Jonathan had all these really tall knitted jumpers in one room that could be tied together or got inside, and it was just a playroom. It's kind of brilliant. So both of those, I think, were just really lovely. And then the photographs of the kids, the children wearing these, were just beautiful, and the photographs were amazing. They were so kind of open, really interesting shots, and then they were shown as well. And I think it was quite interactive as a show with the different groups coming to it.
But I think you're right. There is a sort of funny kind of contradiction with clothes and textiles in that they are made as utilitarian things to wear, things to dress a table, to upholster a thing. And at the same time, in museological terms, they're incredibly delicate, and they're sensitive to light and to gravity. And so when we did the show at Raven Row with Seth Siegelhaub and his extraordinary and wild textile collection that goes from Coptic burial tunics, 3rd century, to things that he picked up at the flea market in Brussels in the late 90s. And they are kind of fake African textiles made in the basement in Brussels. And there was this sort of history of the world in textiles. And then there was Seth Siegelhaub, who collected them, was this amazing kind of radical conceptual art pioneer. And then there was a conservator who was then sort of restoring them and then putting them on kind of acid-free paper. And
Seth was just flinging about barehanded.
More or less wearing them. And to the absolute horror of the textile conservator. And that was one of the things that made the exhibition really exciting, is that he refused to accept a museological take on it. And in fact, so the show ends up being more, you could say, almost like a conceptual artwork than a true textile collection, at least in the way that the V&A may understand it. So all of that becomes really interesting. And then at the most contemporary end, with somebody with like a practicing, like a current designer like Jonathan Anderson, that goes into another place. So that's what's really interesting about these exhibitions, is that you're having to relate to the artifacts in so many different ways, from kind of precious, kind of incredibly untouchables, to this stuff that's just really everyday life. And then somehow, how do you present it so that it somehow is evocative and exciting to a viewer.
And Ray from Ray, one of the nice things with Seth was that it kind of used the buildings, the fact that they were shops and then houses, the fact that there had been, he showed the kind of silks that would never have been allowed when those silks were banned in that area, you know, in the 1700s, I think, and he loved showing them in that place that they shouldn't have been there. But equally, as you got up to the kind of the bedroom quarters and things, then the display became much more like armoires or cupboards and slightly more domestic in feel. So it just shifted as it went through.
And you've also then worked on, in the commercial sense, on the J.W. Anderson flagship store in Soho, Paul Smith in Mayfair. So how have you translated that in terms of those projects?
I think the retail projects, which have all been about somehow related to fashion. So the very first one, 2001, was Okini. Then there was Paul Smith. Then Blue Mountain School in East London, and more recently J.W. Anderson's flagship shop in Soho. And they're all kind of about street life, about place, and about how retail has added a kind of whole language of architecture to the city, to the way that it's kind of the way people move around, the way that they see things, who and when, and so even things like the story of shopfronts is a social history, it's an architectural history, it's a fashion history. So it's really exciting. So, and I guess all of the projects are about street life. So the J.W. Anderson's is really about Soho, and it's a bit trashy.
Totally, yeah.
And it's a bit
transgressive. It's a bit.
So
he
it's somehow there's a little bit of kind of the whole kind of queer culture. There is a lot of sort of, you know, the late night supermarkets with their trashy.
With their neons and things flashing, and one's broken and things are out of line.
And then downstairs it's rather more plush, but on the street it's sort of a bit. You're not quite sure whether you're in the high life or in the low life. Whereas in Paul Smith, in Mayfair, it's definitely the high life. This is well cut. It's discreet and well cut.
The pandemic has kind of almost fast-tracked this explosion in the consumption of the virtual world. And fast images are being very rapidly produced and consumed. You've said that most of your work, compared to other architects, is not Instagram friendly. So what does that mean for how audiences experience your buildings?
When did we say that? Did you say that?
Tom said that.
Yeah, probably Tom said that.
I told you not all of it is true.
I don't know, but it is true a little bit, because I think all the projects are so spatially kind of led. They're not necessarily understood as just a single viewpoint, I think. And the stories and the narratives that you discover, they are quite physical.
We tend not to be so interested in the singularity of an object, and that you can then click and then somehow get it. So most of the work, for better or for worse, is something that kind of unfolds as you experience it, as you visit it, even when it's very small. So even J.W. Anderson's store, which is tiny, actually is a whole sequence of different experiences. I think we're not, maybe...
You can Instagram MK. I mean, the local school's made a Christmas card already.
Yeah, so things do pop up on Instagram, particularly the fashion ones, actually.
Yeah.
Paul Smith one, J.W. Anderson, in particular, they pop up quite a lot, and MK does, because it's got this sort of big circle and it's shiny.
A lot of the houses do, yeah.
So, but I suppose that we're not necessarily looking for that. That's for, in a sense, it's great when other people find it.
And Jürgen's the best, because actually he does such amazing photographs, and the building's in it all the time, actually. But the piece in that building, which is 60 metres long, and goes from one building through the garden to the next, when you get there and it's a quiet day and he hasn't got 100 people there for a shoot, it's amazing. It feels like you're in a kind of foundation or something. And I think some of those things are even surprising to us. It was so peaceful. It's just beautiful.
Do you think
Sorry, I don't know if you can say that about your own.
Do you think that whole Instagrammable moment is influencing the types of buildings that are being commissioned? I mean, do you think people are...
I think that there are... I think
maybe it's not influencing us.
Well, I was going to say, I think that it may be a more natural space within which, let's say, maybe the next generation of architects will be working in. I think to some extent, I mean, we're sort of half on Instagram. You know, we're on it, but we don't actually produce on it. We don't actually do very much. I think that it's not something...
But a lot of our projects are on there, to be fair.
It's not something that we put a lot of... I don't think we've ever had a conversation that goes, how will this look on Instagram, right?
But equally, like, it tends to be that our work is always word of mouth, and that's really great because we get really amazing range of projects, but a lot of shared values and like-minded clients. But so that's great, but it can veer from flagship store to kind of 68-room halls of residence to block in Melbourne, you know, city block,
but I think
walk-up village. So it's not...
There is a concern. I feel like there is a concern about the way that architecture has been over the last decade and a half, has been reduced to a few bite-sized images. So the D-zine culture, where you have 6 photographs and a press release, and it goes out there, and then people kind of gives it the thumbs up or thumbs down in a way that's pretty crude, really, compared with, you know, because these are real places in the world that actually affect people's lives, and it's not really about that. And I think that it's important. I think it's very important that one remains critical of a kind of an image-obsessed culture, which, as you say, we process. I think that somebody said recently, you know, that by lunchtime we've processed more images than in a lifetime in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So I was going to take a photo of you for Instagram.
Okay, on that note. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Well, on that note, thank you both very much for your time.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm Dr. Jean Sherman, founder and director of SCCI, the Sherman Centre for Culture and Ideas. You've been watching a SCCI Cinéphile Hub episode. This episode has been proudly supported by the SCCI Cinéphile Circle of private patrons. We are grateful for their generous assistance alongside a number of commercial, educational, cultural and government organisations, including the City of Sydney. More episodes are available for you to enjoy at sky.org.au. Thank you for joining us.